January Tynwald saw some interesting business transacted, including strategic air services, a new government recruitment control framework, and an announcement that the doctors' industrial action had been averted. Here's what Health Minister Claire Christian told me on Tuesday.
Yes, I'm really pleased to advise the public and obviously the Tynwald members that late last night Manx Care and the BMA reached an agreed position, which has now resulted in the industrial action plan for this week to be deferred in view of that. So, I want to reassure the Manx public that this, obviously the nuances of that, it's been put to the BMA are putting it to their members, so I can't really talk about the detail of that, but they have deferred the industrial strike.
And effectively this means that people whose appointments have been cancelled already, are they going to be invited to attend the appointments after all?
Yes, Manx Care will, obviously, once that final part has happened, they will start contacting patients to, if they can, to reschedule those appointments over the coming days that they was going to be cancelled.
Tynwald members were very keen to understand, does this mean an additional overspend by the department, or does it mean a cut in services? And I guess from your answer you were implying that another way has been found.
Yeah, another way has been found, but again, I hate to not say this, but the members of the BMA need to review this before. So the negotiations are still just slightly ongoing. But yes, there have other ways been found, and that will hopefully offset any additional costs or cuts. So the deal that has been that is down, as far as I'm aware, is for 23-24, 24-25, and obviously we'll be looking at going forward after that.
Health Minister Claire Christian. Next up, DfE Minister Tim Johnson and Andrew Stewart, the DfE's Director of Policy and Strategy.
Well, Phil, this is our strategic air service policy, and this is about setting a framework out really to build on what we're already doing and sort of formalise a framework for our connectivity going forward. I think we all recognise right across the island the importance of our connectivity. It's a massively important issue for any island, and it has been a challenging time especially since COVID. We've seen huge changes in the way people travel and the airline industry generally. And it's important as a government that we make sure that we've got those links in place. I mean, the harsh reality is that since COVID, we've seen a 25% drop in air passenger numbers coming through the airport. So from over 800,000 down to around 600,000. That's a challenge, and we want to build back on that, and we want to make sure that we've got those key, core, important routes into the UK and Ireland. The document talks about that. It talks about the key areas into the northwest of England and into London and into Dublin and Ireland as a core, but then also building from that and hopefully do more and building more routes. But it's important that it comes to Tynwald, because up until now it's an area we've already been working on and been supporting airlines to come to the island. It's important that debate happens in Tynwald and that we put a proper framework in place going forward so everybody understands what we're trying to do.
And in terms of all of this, because I suppose many people will think, well, we've had an open skies policy for several decades now, and that seems to have worked until COVID. And yet if you read through the document, and particularly the appendix at the end, which was the study into the various air routes, the conclusion was Liverpool is fine and doesn't really need very much by way of support. And beyond that, everything else needed some level of intervention to keep it secure.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you look, and I think the key to this is it's not just about having one carrier or I think the key to this is making sure that we've got something that's sustainable and that's also giving us choice and flexibility across the day, so that we've got that mix of day return services that suit business, services that suits the visitor economy. So when we look at it in the whole, when we look at that, we say, okay, we've traditionally had an air link to London, for example, to Gatwick, but clearly there's real benefit for us to have also connections into Heathrow and into London City, especially for our business community. And as a department, what we've been able to do is really look into that and understand the value of that, which then gives us the confidence to be able to support a route, because we can put numbers behind that. And then that's the important thing, is we need to look at this, as I say, in a strategic way. So we've been doing that, but it has been quite piecemeal. So I think the important thing is we look at it in the whole to make sure that we're targeting things in the right way. So that's looking at what incentives and disincentives we can use to make sure that we're servicing the areas, the country and the airports we want to, but also making sure that we're not overheating an area that may require some disincentives to that, make sure that doesn't happen. But I think the other important principle is making sure that we have that choice through working with more than one airline, and obviously we work with a large international carrier like EasyJet, but also the important relationship we have with a regional airline, and obviously the work we're doing with Loganair. So that relationship, how they work together, how that works to the benefit of us on the island, is important.
There is a cost associated with supporting some of these routes too. Roughly, obviously I wouldn't want you to go into all the confidential detail for each route, but roughly how much taxpayers' money is going into this?
Well, you roughly say at the moment that there's about £2 million supporting the Northwest, and there's about £2 million supporting London. And that's sort of figures we're looking at the moment. And I think it's fair to say, going forward, as we look to put the strategy in place, I don't think we'll be looking at necessarily less than that. And I think we need to, but that will develop. And we don't really fully know that until we sit down and start having that next level of conversation with the airlines. And I think once we got this hopefully passed through Tynwald and we get the support for it, we can start doing that. We have been having conversations, but it gives us the ability to drill down and have much deeper conversations once we have this policy in place.
And the other core route that was mentioned in the document, of course, is Dublin. I know the Chamber of Commerce have had some concerns about that particular route and its lack of reliability. Is there any support going into that route?
Well, that route is already running. That's in place. I think, again, we would want to have those conversations with the airlines or airliners running in that area, and if we can do more to support Dublin for more frequent routes. I think also discussions around Northern Ireland as well. I think we recognise that for a lot of people on the Isle of Man, having those links to Belfast are also important. That's been challenging at the moment. But again, let's sit down with the airlines and let's have a bigger conversation about, well, what are the opportunities to grow business, what are the opportunities to grow the visitor economy, and how we can then sustain these routes throughout the year, rather than some of them being temporary, or even sadly at the moment some of them being withdrawn altogether.
One of the things that I certainly found interesting was that internationally air traffic numbers seem to be recovering. The Isle of Man, though, the figures for the Isle of Man don't seem to be recovering at the same sort of rate. Is there any understanding at this stage as to why that is?
So that's a valid point, Phil. I mean, make that in the document as well. That and this actually is borne out by the independent review that was done in 2021 as well, that forecast around about a 99% to 100% recovery of the aviation travel market by roughly this time, and that has broadly been seen on an international level or at a macro level. But actually, when you break it down into regions, and particularly small regions and island jurisdictions, we're not actually too dissimilar to others in this space. There's obviously a number of factors. It's actually been quite difficult for the airline industry itself to recover post-COVID. They have had issues with aircraft availability and spare availability for their fleets. Crewing, clearly, we all lost training hours, and that applied all the way through to our own air traffic control, which has had quite a bit of coverage in the last few years. And then that feeds into a general confidence. And I think that has been, it's another one of the reasons why government, it is proposed, intervenes and continues intervening, certainly over the short to medium term from now, to get to that strong foundation again. There's still quite a lot of moving parts in the industry. And we have to be honest that, we are competing against other markets, and other jurisdictions are doing more than us in terms of providing support for carriers, providing incentives for new airlines to start up. And the document is proposing that actually government needs to step into this space and do so on a strategic basis into the medium term to give us a good platform to move forward from.
And of course, this all matters because for every year that goes by where we don't recover the post or pre-COVID figures, the airport is losing a lot of money. That extra 150, 200,000 people can make a huge difference in terms of the profitability of the airport.
Absolutely, and broader than that, I would say there's an economic argument for government to be active in this space. So government supports lots of key and critical services. This document effectively says that our air connectivity is one of those key parts of national infrastructure, and whether that's the actual operation of the physical airport, as well as the routes, as well as the services, to enable services that meet the needs of residents, yes, absolutely essential. Business travellers, of course. But also thinking about our inbound market as well, on our visitors and travel. Actually, the way you sustain aviation routes and air routes is largely driven by actually inbound traffic rather than outbound traffic. But we have to consider everything in the round. Operating an airport will require a certain level of investment regardless of the number of people that go through it, whether there's 2 flights a day or whether there's 100 flights a day. Those core costs of actually maintaining an airport operating for 14, 16, 18 hours a day are going to be the same broadly. So the more we can use that asset and the more we can actually make the case, there's a real strong economic argument for government to be intervening in this space.
And I think we shouldn't underestimate the changes we've seen excuse me, in the airline market, especially in the UK. I said we're working closely with Loganair, building those relationships. Loganair now, its nearest rival is 5 times smaller. We've seen a huge consolidation in the airline market in the UK since COVID. We've also seen the closure of quite a lot of small airports. This is a challenge that other areas are facing. So it's that process of building back from a very difficult position.
And of course, one of the other significant challenges you face is, whilst I hear the economic argument, and I'm sure it's a very sound argument, certainly from my reading of your document, it looked very sound in terms of the information you've supplied. The other big issue, or probably the biggest issue that faces governments around the world at the moment is climate change. And there is a small chapter in the document that refers to sustainability, but quite clearly increasing air travel is not completely compatible. In fact, you could say it's the opposite end of the spectrum to compatible with ambition to move to net zero.
And that's why we were very keen that we did include an element in this. Clearly, that we can see conflict between those two messages. I think we have to recognise, though, and that's what the document seeks to do, and why it's included, is that the island will always have to rely to some extent on air travel. Yes, there are other modes of transport. We are seeing other jurisdictions clearly trying to clamp down on air travel, but that's when there are other realistic and affordable forms of ground transportation. Now, of course, clearly we have sea services, which form an important part of the island's connectivity landscape. But as an island jurisdiction, and as a regional jurisdiction, certainly as an island, there will always be a reliance to some extent on air travel, and we have to recognise that. And our climate change ambitions don't cut across that completely. But what we do say is, we need to recognise our part in this is quite a small part in this aviation market. We are seeing changes. We're seeing changes to engine models on aircraft that are in use to the Isle of Man now. The regional airlines operate with the most efficient class of aircraft that's available at the moment. And you will see further advances in sustainable aviation fuels as well. So whilst the Isle of Man can't necessarily be the vanguard of aviation climate change, there are considerable efforts happening across the industry now, which the Isle of Man will effectively benefit from as industry changes and catches up, recognising that the island will always have to have some form of reliance on air travel.
No plans as yet for a tunnel to Liverpool then?
Not that I'm aware of, Phil. No, I haven't heard about that one. But I think, ultimately, connectivity is about the economy as well. It's about having a growing, thriving economy. We don't have that without connectivity, and therefore we can't fund and invest on Ireland if we don't have that. So there's always a tension between the goal set out I think, with any climate change policy, and the realities of actually how you make that work and how you fund it, I would argue that we take a fairly pragmatic approach in the island and that with our policies on that. We're not looking to be first to everything, but we recognise that we have to work together.
And then I suppose the final question: what difference is this going to make? I mean, in a year's time, 5 years' time, what difference is the travelling public going to notice?
Well, what I would hope to see is a basic confidence of connectivity to our adjacent isles, and the recognition that there's going to be affordable, frequent connections to those key parts of the country that people want to go to, those key lifelines, and whether it's to Liverpool, Manchester, say into London and into Ireland. But also what we want to see is to work with airlines to try and build on that and start to rebuild more of our sort of regional connectivity, recognising those other important parts of the country into the southwest, into Scotland, up into the north of England, other areas, Northern Ireland. So, working with airlines to make that work and be sustainable. But I think that's the point. It has to be sustainable. I think the basis of the Open Skies policy that's been around now for 30 years, I think the principle is right. This is not about regulation. This is about working with airlines to make sure that it's to everyone's benefit, because that, to me, builds a more sustainable future, and that's what we're all wanting to see. And having that long-term connectivity, we all know how vitally important it is.
DfE Minister Tim Johnson there. Juan Watterson seemed somewhat lukewarm in his assessment of various government items. You had a question, effectively, to the Enterprise Minister to see what assessments had been done as to how successful or otherwise those schemes had been. What did you think of the answer?
Well, I wasn't over enamoured that, in fairness to the department, they've done an awful lot of work this time in terms of setting up some metrics that they're going to look at and they're going to measure against going forward. What I didn't get the sense of is that they'd based it on any real experience of previous schemes. And these schemes go back to 2009, and we only got today about, reviews of the 2019 scheme, and they know that the schemes that have gone back far further than that. And actually, some of the big works that happened came out of those earlier schemes. Some of the capital schemes about the regeneration of Castletown Square, Station Road, Port Eyre, and other places, and even to Strand Street itself, and the extensions down Castle Street, they came out of those early regeneration schemes. So you'd like to think that they'd learned lessons from that, and it's very disappointing really to hear that exercise hasn't really been done, and they've started all over again from scratch.
Yes, because many millions of pounds were spent, and certainly the fabric of our town centres were was improved by this work. But yeah, it would be interesting, certainly as a former minister involved in some of this stuff, to actually know what tangible benefit, what real economic benefit happened.
Yeah, so that's about sort of the value for money. One thing I do bang on around down here is about getting value for money. Well, if you're not really setting yourself up with a set of clear objectives as to where you're going, then that's always going to be questionable. So, if there's one thing they do seem to have learned, is that they need to put some better metrics and start to measure outcomes. And so I do give them credit for that. Looking in the rearview mirror, though, I think they still could do better. There is some areas for optimism in this local economy strategy, that they do seem to have missed the elephant in the room of minimum wage increases and how that's going to affect local traders. It's going to have a big impact. There is going to need to be transition. There is going to need to be support for businesses in trying to help them manage that transition, and that seems to have been completely in the blind spot today, and that was another sort of disappointment of a scheme that really sort of has so much potential.
I note every time I pass it the stone, the foundation, or the commemorative stone at Ballacubban Estate in Colby, when a relatively new MHK, Juan Watterson, was member for housing and opened the scheme. Are you surprised it's taken so long to move to the second part of that scheme? And do you think that the scheme is needed in the area?
I think the scheme is needed in the area. It was needed then, it's needed now. What is interesting is about the mix of housing that's gone in there. It was probably intended to be slightly more single units or 1 or 2 bedroom units that were going to go into that scheme in a previous iteration, because that was where the identified need was. It has to be put into the context of Station Park, just over the road, a big scheme, but we're growing the population, but we're not growing the number of local authority houses on the island. And that's been another theme today about rent increases and having to increase rent in order to be able to invest in properties. That does need to happen, and we do still need to get that right mix of public and private support, first time buyers on the one hand, local authority housing on the other, to make sure that all of our people have decent homes that are appropriate to their way of life.
And it was great to hear in your comments on that debate that there had been a more substantial briefing given in private to members about the capital schemes, that there was this one for Ballacubban and there was another one in relation to... was it
drainage?
Was it the care home as well?
Yeah.
And as you said, there was the information was given in the briefings to Tynwald members, but we are still in a position, probably 20, 30 years on, with capital schemes of the public really not having much information provided as to what these millions of pounds are being spent on.
No, and I think when we were sort of starting out, there was much more put there. We had many more votes on capital schemes that would come forward and get scrutiny by the whole court. And the Treasury or the relevant department would come and ask for the money in order to go and build something of significant importance. We don't see those anymore. So these quarterly processes of the capital SACIC, as it's called, the Strategic Asset Unit, are going to be the way forward, then really that's the place where they need to be explaining what these schemes are, what the benefits are, what the costs are, to allow Tynwald members to scrutinise that. And that's all well and good in the Borough Suite, but there's no permanent record there. So if ministers promise something in the Borough Suite, that's not the same as a promise on the record in Tynwald that they can be held against in future. And that's a really important distinction, and that's what Parliament is for, to make sure that we hold people to account, that when we set out to go and deliver a project, that we actually know what that project is, what it's going to cost, how it's going to be delivered, so that when you get to the end of it, you can see whether it went right or wrong. It's the bread and butter of the Public Accounts Committee. And when government gets that right every time, there won't be a need for the Public Accounts Committee. But I don't think we're going anywhere soon.
And the other area that you rather cleverly spotted was the open check in relation to strategic air services. Effectively, there was no financial control really in relation to that.
Well, this is all coming out of the Economic Development Fund. The Economic Development Fund, it's a slush fund for government. There's a little bit of post hoc reporting about where the money has gone. Some of that's been glossed over in commercial confidentiality. So I have serious concerns about the way that fund is operating. And I appreciate that sometimes there are commercial matters, but really this is government, this is taxpayers' money. We should be doing far more to make sure that these things are open and transparent if people are going to benefit from taxpayers' money.
The case made for the funding seemed to be pretty sound. At least we got probably far more detail in relation to the thinking behind the need for these schemes, but obviously the exact amount for each route was not available, presumably for commercial reasons.
Well, we know that in the past certain routes have been underwritten. We don't know exactly which ones or how much or on what basis. And I think we deserve to know a little bit more about that. One of the fundamental... There's been sort of two arguments put about this. One is about the needs of business, but I believe in the past, I'm sure business made a co-payment to that to make sure that facility, that flexibility was available to them. That doesn't seem to be the case now. And the other one was about tourism. Well, if we're going to attract tourism to some of these routes, then we need to have a bit more impact on price. And if you look at tickets to London City, for example, it's about twice the amount to Gatwick. I appreciate it's a slightly different product, but it is a more flexible product. What we want, surely, then is bums on seats. So we need to be selling these tickets cheaper if you're going to fill them. So what's our money? And £4 million was mentioned. What's that really buying us in terms of connectivity, in terms of selling the island as a tourist destination, about the capacity of getting more people here to spend the money, and also making sure that we can still meet the needs of business who need to get down to London and turn deals around in a day.
Were you impressed with the Chief Minister's latest announcement on efficiencies?
Save 2. The devil's going to be in the detail. There doesn't seem to be much new in there. It does seem like a second thrash at Save. There's an awful lot being pinned on digital transformation. That's not new, so it'll be interesting to see what the catalyst is going to be to drive that forward at pace, as opposed to going forward in the way that it has been.
And in relation to headcount, there seem to be more exceptions than there are people actually covered by the new control mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, the personnel control mechanism was abandoned because it was leading to what you might call bad behaviours by departments, people retaining people on private contracts and sort of using cash rather than headcount. So there does need to be a RIC on both headcount and on budgets as well. So I think that bit's sound. Mars, it's never gone away. But if you look at where the growth of headcount has been, it's almost entirely been the explosion in Manx Care staffing. And again, we're still struggling to get a grip of what we're getting for our money within the health service. I think the health department's struggling with that. We've been around the houses with it a couple of times in the Public Accounts Committee, trying to assess value for money in the health service, and the results have always been unsatisfactory. It's always been a case of, well, we don't know, we don't have the data, we can't prove it, and again, there's that sort of must do better. And if this digital transformation is going to assist in that in a way, that's going to help a lot, I hope.
That was Speaker of the House of Keys, Ewan Watterson. The Chief Minister gave some more detail about the government efficiencies he trumpeted last autumn.
Obviously, the outlining the efficiencies programme, which is designed to give us £50 million of cashable savings over the next 5 years, and effectively the launch of that programme. I touched on the two other supporting mechanisms that were being brought in around that, and obviously the critical part of that was the recruitment control framework, which would help us specifically to identify and control vacancies, and to make departments think about how vacancies were being assessed, and particular senior vacancies. And also the third element of that was to talk about the recruitment personnel report that we've recently produced, and how that was going to help us get to the facts about the size of government, and the facts about where staff were located, and of course where over time we will see clearly over quarter by quarter period where there has been growth, and of course where there's been reduction, and of course a justification as to why they have grown or reduced the size of that particular department. There are, in relation to that control of appointments, the review of the worthiness or otherwise of posts, there are an awful lot of exceptions, aren't there? Well, there were exceptions given, and those were mostly around individuals where a post was fulfilling a statutory requirement, i.e. it was a legal requirement on government, or it was a frontline role, and particularly teachers, frontline medical staff and police, I think, were the critical examples highlighted. But yes, where it is providing a frontline service in those categories, they have been singled out where there is not a need to go through the recruitment control framework. I will have, fundamentally this has been applied to central government, but I will be pressing to understand, particularly via the DHSC Minister, the Health Minister, what Manx Care's proposal is for recruitment controls, because having produced this report, having spent actually many weeks getting all the data together so that we could get a proper, accurate picture, obviously the key highlight was that Manx Care had grown by 400 or so staff in 4 years. Now, that's got to be clearly now justified, and also given their substantial overspends, one needs to understand what controls they will have in place, particularly to control growth moving forward.
There was a little bit of frustration that you seem to express during the questioning on your statement, in that members were concerned, some members anyway, were concerned about employment rights and this and that, but these were the same members that had been saying that government was too big. So perhaps listeners would understand your frustration.
Look, yeah, you come to Tynwald and you tell them that you're bringing in measures to drive productivity, to create efficiencies, and to control headcount. And of course, I was a bit surprised to find the automatic reaction was what one is doing to ensure that job security was maintained throughout the organisation. And there is a natural sort of, well, you can't have it both ways view on these sorts of things. And it's not surprising that I expressed that to members of Tynwald. But the key thing is, I think, from an employment perspective, I mean, government has got to get smaller. We have got to digitise. We have got to increase our productivity and our efficiency. And we've got to utilise the tools, the modern tools, such as artificial intelligence and the digital advances that we're seeing to help us achieve that. We know that we are under huge financial pressure. We know that we are running a deficit. And in a couple of weeks' time, we will obviously hear from the Treasury Minister as the overall state of the finances projected, for this year, and of course looking forward to next year. But there's no question that the deficit is significant. And on top of that, we have all these additional pressures, particularly with healthcare spending, but also other departments, education being one, where there is growing demand for increased funding. And of course, we had a tax increase last year. Now, we have got to get control of the public sector, and part of the answer to that is increasing efficiencies, is digitalisation, is looking at people and how they are employed. And I hope that what we are doing is really going to help kickstart a fresh drive and awareness, both within senior management in departments, but also amongst employees, to seek that maximum value. And I also hope that we can bring some more initiatives forward during the course of this that will help employees and indeed service users add value to the process and help us identify where we can get these wins in terms of increasing efficiency and productivity of the public sector.
And of course, that productivity thing is the crucial element. I mean, you can, using your new employment control mechanism, you could significantly reduce the head count, but also at the same time increase the expenditure by effectively getting contractors in to do the work that currently head-counted people are doing. But the core way in which you're going to reduce the size of government is by improving productivity. Yeah,
and a lot of that obviously can come through sort of changes to the actual way services are being delivered, but a lot of that could be through digitalisation and trying to maximise the opportunities that exist with the advances that we're seeing. And let's face it, Phil, I mean, I think everybody agrees. Governments, at least outward-facing digitisation, has not kept pace with technology. Our entry points into government are poor. We can do so much more. There's so much more benefit that the user of government services can have. And I highlighted a couple of those. Obviously, that sort of gov.im entry point is very, very poor. It's on very old systems at the moment. We can do more there. We could look at enhancing direct debit payments so people can pay their bills easier where they are due to different elements of government. We can improve the speed of delivery when it comes to accessing other areas of services. We can improve our procurement service, for example, which should speed up indeed delivery to the private sector of government projects. So there's a lot of stuff conceptually that we can do. You know, the job now of the Operations Performance Board and predominantly the executive, but of course driven by the programme board, will be to capitalise on these opportunities, to turn them into reality. Obviously, make sure there's a proper measurement around that, and communicate that effectively to everybody. And I think a number of members were keen to know how we were going to communicate this, and there will be a website set up, and that will demonstrate what projects are underway and what benefit they're going to bring to the community and to the efficiency of public services.
That was Chief Minister Alf Cannon. Former Minister Lawrie Hooper had a lot to say in Tynwald. You've had a fairly active Tynwald. You certainly were interested in the question that was asked of the Health Minister in relation to the settlement of the doctors' pay dispute.
Yes, it was a good question to ask, actually, if the doctors were planning to threaten to go on strike. I'm glad that's been resolved, actually, but what was quite concerning was the Minister didn't seem able to articulate just where the money was going to come from.
But what the Minister perhaps was intimating was that there is a more efficient way of delivering some of the services, and that's something that's been negotiated as part of this deal.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, there were lots of ideas as to how you could run services in a different way in terms of the way you cover your staff costs. Most of those would impact on patients. There are ways of doing it that wouldn't have such an impact on patients, but those ones tend to be the decisions that are harder to make and harder to get buy-in for. And I can appreciate why the Minister wouldn't want to necessarily go into lots of detail before they'd finish those negotiations with staff. So it'll be interesting to see now what comes out of those negotiations, whether the Doctors' Union accepts this pay offer, and then whether or not they're able to negotiate and agree what some of those changes might have to look like in order to fund it without impacting on patients.
Another item that was raised that you had some criticism of was the local economy strategy, which ostensibly is a good thing. I mean, it's much needed. Many of our town centres in particular are struggling at the moment. So what was your concern about that?
So the strategy itself, actually, I didn't have any issues with. You're right, we really need it. Our town centres definitely need some investment and some revitalisation. The problem I had with the strategy was, as often is the case with government, they set out the things they'd like to achieve, but then don't really tell you how we're going to measure them on it. So they say things like, we're going to reduce vacancy rates. Great. How are you going to do that? Exactly. And what does that mean? Well, what do you think good looks like? If you've managed to fill one shop at the end of your strategy and spent £5 million, is that a big tick in the box? I would argue probably not. But because the strategy was quite vague on some of that stuff, it's kind of hard to have a lot of confidence in it, and especially when the Minister didn't bring it to Tynwald for approval. He didn't want Tynwald to endorse the strategy. He just wanted to present it to us as this is the strategy, this is what we're doing. There was no attempt really to try and tell Tynwald or try and ask Tynwald, what do you think? Do you think this is the right thing to do? So it was quite an interesting debate to have really, in that the Minister, if he'd had real confidence in his strategy, he would have come to Tynwald and said, this is the right thing to do, let's get it endorsed. And he didn't do that, which was quite concerning. But the problems I had actually were with the funding that goes with it. If you look at the scheme, it is a blank cheque for government. It is a scheme that just says the Department for Enterprise can spend money on what they've broadly termed regeneration. And that's very broadly drawn. And my worry with the scheme, as with so many government schemes, is because there is no oversight and no checks and balances built into it, you're entirely reliant on government making good decisions. And where you've got schemes in the DFE, some of them are run exceptionally well, and I used to be politically responsible for the schemes over there. And the ones that work well are the ones that actually are quite well controlled with proper oversight. Where we've had issues in the past where things haven't worked well, things like the Media Development Fund or the stuff we had with the Spark Investment Fund, the EDS I think it was called, those kind of schemes haven't worked very well because they've had much more lax oversight. And I think that's the risk you're running with this new scheme. Again, the oversight is quite lax, and so you're running the risk that ministers will run off and spend this money, but actually there's no real way of knowing whether it's been spent well, and that's because the strategy doesn't have some of those effective targets built into it. So yeah, overall as a package, it was concerning, I think, to see that it come through in that approach. What was more concerning was when myself and a number of other members asked a lot of questions of the Minister, he just didn't answer them. Not that he tried and failed, he just made no effort at all to answer any of our questions. And again, that that doesn't exactly build confidence, because on the one hand he's saying trust me with your money, trust me with taxpayers' money with no oversight, but actually I don't know this stuff well enough to be able to explain it to you, and again that really doesn't fill me with confidence.
It is, though, one of the constant battles with any scheme. I recall this in various roles that I held when I was in government. The better it is controlled is inevitably means the less flexibility there is, so that circumstances that hadn't been imagined when the scheme was drawn up, if it's a really tightly controlled scheme, those circumstances can't be covered by the scheme.
Yeah, and that's fair, and that's kind of what you want, is you want to find the right balance between oversight and flexibility. You want the department to be able to say, oh, we didn't think about that when we put this together, so we can make some minor changes to the scheme. The problem with this scheme is it isn't just minor changes. There is no oversight at all. So, for example, the current maximum in the scheme is £100,000. There is nothing that stops them from tomorrow just changing that, upping it, downing it. They could say, oh, it would be £1 million now, and there's nothing Tynwald could do about it. That is entirely within their gift, and that's the worry that I've got, especially when you're dealing with economic development, and there is a lot of money that does get moved around. The worry is that you get someone that comes along and says, look, I need £500,000, and they find a reason to increase the scheme to that limit for that purpose, and there's no oversight. And the other problem I had with it was the government has made a number of promises over the years about what was going to be in this scheme. So specifically, and you'll be aware of recent issues with banks, so the number of banks are closing in the north now. One of the things that was supposed to happen was this scheme was supposed to be able to fund, to help businesses invest in digital payments. So businesses that don't take cash, helping them actually say, you know what, we can start taking digital payments and things now. That was supposed to be in this scheme. That's what the Access to Cash Review response said they would do, and they didn't do it. And so actually, when you've got government departments making promises and then just ignoring the promises they've made, again, it doesn't fill you with confidence. So when the whole ethos of what they're saying is, give us loads of flexibility because you can trust us, but then they're evidencing that you just can't trust them, that's a real problem.
The other items that you had on the order paper were withdrawn. I think the suggestion is that as you're in the DOI now and the two items are vaguely DOI related, you could deal with that better in there.
So in terms of the transfer of the reselling powers, that's the case. So the previous minister of the DOI said he was happy to help me with that, and actually the new minister has made the same commitment, so that one I can deal with hopefully internally. It's a relatively straightforward transfer of functions, hopefully over to Cura, which will help resolve some issues that I'm aware of, not just in Ramsey but elsewhere. So yes, being in the government sometimes has its moments. The other item was about an all-Ireland leisure rate in respect of swimming pools, and I was aware that the government were going to table an amendment to it that would have essentially kicked it into the long grass and made it untenable, and they naturally automatically have the votes to do what they like these days, so there wasn't any real point in going through the motions. But helpfully I had a conversation with my constituency colleague, the Treasury Minister, and we've agreed to sit down and talk about actually what can we come up with that might work for everybody. So again, it's not gone away, it's something that I'm going to try and resolve through maybe a different route, but essentially it's something that is going to come back.
Because there are several unfairnesses in relation to the rates system on the island. This one in particular that's often highlighted is that the East doesn't have a regional pool, therefore doesn't have a regional pool rate, but it does have some really fantastic facilities funded by the taxpayer. And whereas Douglas has a case in as much as it gifted the land for some of this, the other large and wealthy local authorities in the East pay nothing.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think Douglas, they gifted the land, what was it, 30 years ago? More than that. I think they've probably got value out of that by now, quite frankly. And yes, and I actually, this is the issue I had with the government's amendment, because they were planning on suggesting that we fold other things into this kind of all-island rate. You could do libraries, you could do waste collection, you could do all sorts of stuff. And the issue I've got with that is the rating system is fundamentally broken. So in terms of extending a rate that half of us already pay to everybody, that seems to be fair, that seems to make sense, but creating new rates and new taxes for people to pay on top of an already broken system, that feels fundamentally wrong to me. And so whilst I would quite happily engage in a piece of work that looks at investigating an all-island rate for some other services, I think if you're going to do that, you have to fix the rating system first. And so I was really uncomfortable having the government kind of push us in that direction without committing to fixing the rating system. And that's a commitment they haven't made, and they've kind of shied away from over the last couple of years. But again, I think there are ways we can do this. I think there are ways of bringing some more fairness to especially the swimming pool funding. That I think is something we can definitely achieve in the next year and a half, 2 years of this government. Can we fix the rating system in the next 2 years? I would argue not without government really deciding to do it. It might be possible as a private member's bill, but again, there's a phenomenal amount of work in doing that, so I'm not entirely convinced it's possible, but I'll give it a go.
Ramsey MHK Lawrie Hooper there. Finally, Onken MHK Julie Edge had a motion relating to additional educational needs.
So obviously increasingly you get constituents coming to you with concerns. Certainly since September I've had more concerns and become more aware of the pressures on our schools, and it's not the staff, it's more facilities really, and being able to accommodate the rise in the numbers of students. As I said, it's 25% AEN on the Isle of Man, and that's a significant rise, and we do need to be addressing it and looking at it.
I think in the past the department has prided itself by being able to integrate children with additional educational needs into sort of mainstream classes.
Obviously, we've got special units that are already built within the fabric of our infrastructure, but it's more really about the increase in these neurodiverse challenges that are in our schools and how we're accommodating for them. So as I said during the debate, we've previously done sensory areas within special units and that, and I think we are just maximised on that. So is it time we did look at a specialist centre for, say, autism or children on spectrum, but they're not there all the time. They can be in their communities, and I think that came across quite strong in the debate, that you don't want to disconnect them to their community and their schools. But we also heard there's many children travelling from Ramsey. I know there's children travelling, I think, from Ramsey to Onken and that. So they're not necessarily in their own communities at the present time. So I think it is something really valuable to look at. And when the Chief Minister's looking for efficiencies, he has a report in front of him telling him lots of efficiencies, and it's been ignored, really.
The Minister put forward an amendment basically saying, well, we're due to report back to June Tynwald anyway, so surely that was a reasonable compromise?
I asked for a specific report, and as you know, Phil, for them to just come back to Tynwald, it can just be a statement, as we've heard with many things this month. It can just be a statement. I was asking for a specific report. We'd be able to see what the stakeholder engagement's been, what input we've had from our teachers, and what cost analysis they've done, because that was certainly a point in that funding review. And it's really to support the department more than anything. It's not to hinder them, it's to support them.
One of the changes, though, that was announced in Tynwald was the Chief Minister announced or made a statement in relation to the efficiencies that government is hoping to drive forward. One of these was the introduction of a much more stringent assessment of certain employees or certain posts, if they become vacant, whether they should be filled again. You weren't entirely convinced by that?
Not at all. No, I've been in the system a long time. I've seen how it all operates, seen how it works, seen all the renditions of trying to do this, and basically, I don't think we'll see any progress. I personally believe that if the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man standing up saying, this is what we need to do, we're going to make sure there's a member of staff looking at this, what are the managers getting paid for? Some of them are well into the £170,000. What are they getting paid for if they've just been allowing recruitment? But I do blame the policy that the Chief Minister has carried on to utilise, and that's doing it by budgetary formula.
That was former Education Minister Julie Edge. So what do you think? Will the new air services policies bring the certainty air travellers are looking for? And if so, should there be more control over how air routes are funded? Is the local economy strategy going to deliver much needed support to struggling local businesses, and should the effectiveness of previous multi-million pound regeneration work have been assessed? Will the recruitment controls announced by the Chief Minister deliver the reductions in the size of government promised? Lots to ponder from January's Tynwald. I'm Phil Gaughan. Gonna Myers and Geistachram. Thanks for listening.